The ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel in New York buzzed with excitement, a sea of designer suits and glittering gowns under the soft glow of chandeliers. It was the launch party for Ethan Luxe, my little brother's new fashion brand, and the air practically dripped with money and prestige. Ethan Hayes, 30 years old and smug as ever, stood at the center of it all, shaking hands and flashing his perfect teeth, like he'd invented luxury itself. I watched him from the edge of the room, my red dress hugging my frame, a glass of champagne in my hand I hadn't even sipped. No one recognized me yet. Why would they? To them, I'd been gone for 12 years, erased, forgotten, a ghost they'd buried long ago. Then my mother's voice cut through the hum of the crowd. Margaret Hayes, 58 and still the ice queen of high society, spotted me first. Her eyes narrowed as she leaned toward my father, Henry, her voice sharp enough to slice through the chatter. "What's she doing here? Who let that woman in?" She didn't even say my name. Lila. Just that woman, like I was some stranger who'd wandered in off the street. Ethan caught her gaze, followed it to me and smirked, crossing his arms over his tailored blazer. "Oh, look who it is," he drawled, loud enough for the nearby guests to turn. "What, Lila, you here to beg for a handout? Sorry, sis, we don't do charity cases anymore." I didn't flinch, didn't even blink. I just stood there, letting his words bounce off me like rain on glass. 12 years ago, that jab would have cut deep. Back when I was 23, broke and desperate, when they'd kicked me out of their perfect little world. But not now. Now I smiled, slow and deliberate, the kind of smile that says you have no idea what's coming. Margaret adjusted her diamond necklace, her lips curling in that familiar sneer I'd seen 1,000 times growing up. "Honestly, Lila, this is embarrassing. Crawling back after all these years? Have some dignity." Ethan laughed, a short barking sound, and waved a hand dismissively. "Yes, seriously, you're not on the list. Security's gonna love this." He turned, already scanning the room for someone to haul me out, but then he froze, because that's when Jack stepped forward. Jack Carter, his business partner, his right-hand man, and oh yeah, my ex from a lifetime ago. Jack's face went white as a sheet, his champagne flute trembling in his hand. "Lila," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Is that really you?" Margaret's sneer faltered for half a second. Ethan's smirk twitched. Henry, who'd been pretending I didn't exist, finally glanced my way, his bushy brows knitting together. I took a single step forward, my heels clicking against the polished floor, and tilted my head just enough to meet Jack's wide-eyed stare. "Hey, Jack," I said, my voice smooth as silk. "Didn't expect to see me either, huh?" The room didn't go quiet, not yet, but I could feel it, the shift in the air, the first crack in their perfect night. They thought they knew me. They thought I was still the failure they'd thrown away. They were so wrong. 12 years ago, I was 23, standing on the front porch of our family's sprawling house in the Boston suburbs, my breath fogging in the cold October air. My hands were stuffed in the pockets of a threadbare jacket, the only thing I had left after they'd stripped me bare. Figuratively, sure, but it felt literal that night. Margaret stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face a mask of disgust. "You're a failure, Lila," she said, her voice like ice cracking underfoot. "Dropping out of college? Chasing some ridiculous startup dream that went nowhere? You're an embarrassment to this family." She didn't even look at me when she said it, just stared past me like I was already gone. Henry was there too, leaning against the door frame, his graying hair catching the porch light. He didn't say a word, just watched with that blank, tired expression he always wore when he couldn't be bothered to care. Ethan, though, he was 18 then, all sharp edges and teenage arrogance, couldn't resist twisting the knife. "Yeah, sis," he sneered, leaning out from behind Margaret, his hoodie half-zipped like he'd just rolled out of bed. "Well, don't you do us all a favor and disappear. You're dragging us down just by existing," he grinned, that same smug grin I'd see plastered across magazine covers years later. And it took everything in me not to lunge at him right then. I'd messed up, I'll admit it. I'd left college halfway through my junior year, convinced I could build something big, a sustainable clothing line, back when eco-friendly was just starting to catch on. I'd sunk every dime I had into it, borrowed more from friends, even pitched it to my parents like some starry-aimed kid. They'd laughed in my face, called it a pipe dream, and when it crashed and burned 6 months later, they didn't let me forget it. "We've wasted enough on you," Margaret had said that night, her manicured nails tapping the door like she was counting down the seconds until I was gone. "You're 23 now. Figure it out." And then the door slammed shut, the lock clicked, and that was it. I stood there staring at the chipped paint on the frame, my chest tight and my fingers numb. I had maybe $20 in my wallet, a dead phone and a backpack with a couple of shirts and a toothbrush. No plan, no safety net, just the echo of Ethan's laugh and Margaret's words ringing in my ears. I turned and walked down the driveway, the gravel crunching under my sneakers, and didn't look back. Not because I didn't want to. God, I wanted to bang on that door and beg them to let me stay, but because I knew it wouldn't change a damn thing. They'd made up their minds. I was nothing to them. The first night was the worst. I ended up in a parking lot a few miles away, curled up in the bed of an abandoned pickup truck, using my bag as a pillow. The wind cut through my jacket like it was paper, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is how it ends. I didn't sleep, just shivered and stared at the stars, wondering how I'd gone from their daughter, their sister, to this. By morning, my stomach was growling, my legs ached, and I knew I had to move. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let them be right. They thought I'd fade away, prove them right about me being a failure. But standing there in that freezing dawn, wiping tears off my face with a shaking hand, I made a promise to myself. One day I'd come back. And when I did, they'd regret ever letting me go. After that night in the pickup truck, I didn't have much just a gnawing hunger and a stubborn streak that refused to let me give up. I walked into town, my sneakers soaked from the dew, and stumbled into a little hole-in-the-wall cafe called Brew and Bean. It wasn't much, faded paint on the walls, a jukebox that didn't work, but it smelled like coffee and second chances. I didn't have money for a cup, so I just sat there, warming my hands on the edge of a table, until the owner caught me. She was a wiry woman in her 60s, gray hair pulled back tight, with eyes that could spot a lie from a mile away. "You gonna order something, kid, or just take up space?" she asked, her voice gruff but not mean. I mumbled something about being broke, expecting her to kick me out. Instead, she tossed me an apron. "Wash dishes," she said. "Earn your keep." Her name was Clara, and she didn't ask questions, not about the red rims around my eyes or why I flinched every time the door swung open. I scrubbed plates and cups until my hands pruned, and at the end of the shift, she slid a $10 bill across the counter. "Come back tomorrow if you want," she said. I did. Clara wasn't just a cafe owner. She'd been a biochemist once, worked for some big lab before she burned out and traded test tubes for coffee beans. Over the next few weeks, while I scraped grease off pans, she'd talk about science, about life, about how she'd built herself back up after her own family wrote her off. One night, after closing, she caught me doodling ideas for my failed clothing line on a napkin. "You've got a brain," she said, tapping the paper. "Why you wasting it on dishes?" I told her about the startup, the flop, my family. She didn't laugh. She just nodded and said, "You're not done yet. Get back to school." "I'll help." She did. Clara let me crash on a cot in the storage room, fed me leftovers, even co-signed a loan so I could enroll in community college at 24. I studied like my life depended on it, because it did. Biology hooked me, the way cells could adapt, survive, thrive under pressure. It felt personal. By 27, I'd scraped together enough for a scholarship to a master's program in biotech, and Clara was there, beaming when I walked across that stage. "Told you," she said, her voice cracking just a little. After that, I didn't stop. I landed an internship at a startup in San Francisco, working on sustainable food tech, think lab-grown proteins, eco-friendly packaging. I was good at it, really good. At 29, I pitched my own idea. Green Vita, a company blending biotech with nutrition, turning waste into high-value supplements. Investors ate it up. By 33, Green Vita was pulling in millions, disrupting the industry, landing me on magazine covers Ethan probably flipped past without a second thought. I'd built an empire from nothing. No trust fund, no family name, just me and a promise I'd made in that parking lot. Meanwhile, my family had no clue. Margaret was too busy hobnobbing with her charity boards. Henry was coasting on his real estate investments. And Ethan, well, Ethan was chasing his own spotlight. I heard about Ethan Lux through the grapevine, some flashy fashion line he'd launched with Jack, my ex. They thought I was gone, a footnote they'd erased. But I wasn't erased. I was watching. Every article about Ethan's genius, every photo of Margaret's fake smiles at galas, I filed away. Not out of bitterness, okay, maybe a little, but because I knew one day I'd use it. Clara passed away when I was 31, left me a note that just said, "Keep going, kid." I did. Married Daniel, a quiet lawyer who saw through my walls and loved me anyway at 34, built Green Vita into something untouchable, and then, a month ago, I got the invite, Ethan's big launch, a chance to network with the elite. I didn't RSVP. Didn't need to. I wasn't going as a guest. I was going as the reckoning they never saw coming. The Grand Meridian's ballroom was all glitz and noise, glasses clinking, laughter bouncing off the walls, Ethan soaking up the spotlight like he was born for it. I stood there, the red dress catching the light just enough to turn a few heads, but not enough to steal his thunder. Not yet. Ethan spotted me again, his smirk fading into something harder as he pushed through the crowd. "What the hell, Lila?" he snapped, voice low but sharp like he didn't want the whole room hearing, though half of them were already glancing our way. "You think you can just waltz in here and crash my night? Get out before I call security." I didn't budge, just tilted my head and gave him a look that said, "Try me." "I don't need an invite, Ethan," I said, calm as anything, swirling the champagne I still hadn't touched. "I'm here to take back what's mine." He blinked, thrown for a second, then barked out a laugh. Too loud, too forced. "Yours? What, you want a piece of my success now that I've made it? Typical. You always were jealous. Margaret swept over before I could answer, her heels clicking like gunfire on the marble floor. She stopped beside Ethan, her face a mask of disdain, the same one she'd worn 12 years ago. "This is pathetic, Lila," she said, her voice dripping with that upper crust venom she'd perfected. "Showing up here, uninvited, after all this time? What's next? Begging us to take you back? You've got nothing to offer but bitterness." She adjusted her necklace again, a nervous tic she'd never admit to, and I caught the faintest flicker of unease in her eyes. She didn't like me being here. Good. I smiled, slow and easy, letting her words hang there like smoke. "Funny you mention that, Margaret," I said, dropping the mom I'd stopped using years ago. "I'm not the one begging tonight, but you might be soon enough." Her lips twitched, a crack in her armor, but before she could fire back, Ethan stepped closer, his chest puffed up like he was still that bratty 18-year-old. "You're delusional," he hissed. "This is my night, my brand, my life. You don't belong here, never did." That's when Jack pushed through the crowd, his tie slightly askew, sweat beading on his forehead. He'd been hovering near the bar, probably downing his third drink, but now he was right in front of me, his eyes wide and panicked. "Lila?" he said again, like he still couldn't believe it. "Jesus, it's really you? What are you doing here?" His voice cracked and I saw the guilt, the dread, the memory of how we'd ended 12 years ago when he dumped me right after my family did. "Hey, Jack," I said, my tone light but edged with something cold. "Didn't think I'd make it this far, did you?" He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and opened his mouth to say something, anything, but nothing came out. Ethan rounded on him, irritation flaring. "You know her? What's going on, man?" Jack flinched, caught between us, and I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Margaret stepped in, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Enough of this nonsense. Jack, get her out of here. She's a distraction." She waved a hand, dismissing me like I was a fly buzzing around her perfect evening. But Jack didn't move. He just stared at me, his face paling by the second, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. He knew me, knew the old Lila, the one who'd cried on his shoulder when everything fell apart, but this Leela? He didn't know her at all. I took a step closer, close enough to smell Ethan's overpriced cologne, and locked eyes with him. "You're right about one thing, Ethan," I said, my voice steady, quiet enough that only they could hear. "I don't belong in your world anymore. I've built my own, and it's about to crash right through yours." Ethan's smirk faltered. Margaret's hand froze on her necklace. Jack looked like he might bolt. The air between us thickened, heavy with something they couldn't name yet, but they'd find out soon enough. Ethan's jaw tightened as my words sank in, but he recovered fast, rolling his eyes like I'd just told a bad joke. "Crash my world?" he scoffed, loud enough to draw a few curious glances from the guests milling around us. "You're full of it, Lila. Always were. What's your big play here? Gonna cry about how we didn't coddle you enough?" He crossed his arms, smirking again, but it didn't reach his eyes this time. He was rattled, and I could tell. "Bet." I didn't bite, just reached into my clutch and pulled out a slim folder. Nothing fancy, just a few pages clipped together, but it might as well have been a grenade. "This isn't about coddling," I said, holding it up so the light caught the paper. "It's about what you stole." Ethan's smirk froze. Margaret's hand dropped from her necklace, her fingers curling into a fist. Jack took a step back, like he could sense the explosion coming and didn't want to get caught in the blast. "Stole," Ethan laughed, but it came out brittle, forced. "You're insane. I built Ethan Lux from the ground up, my vision, my work. You don't get to waltz in here and claim it." He turned to the crowd, raising his voice for the audience he loved so much. "Can you believe this? My deadbeat sister thinks she's got a stake in my success?" A few people chuckled, but most just watched, sensing the shift, the way the air was starting to crackle. I opened the folder, flipping to the first page. A sketch I'd drawn 12 years ago, back when I was still naive enough to think I could trust people. It was rough, penciled on a napkin from that cafe, but unmistakable. A design for fabric made from bioengineered fibers, lightweight and sustainable. My failed startup's whole pitch. "Recognize this?" I asked, holding it up for Ethan to see. His eyes flicked to it, then away, but not fast enough. I caught the flash of recognition. "What's that supposed to prove?" he snapped, but his voice was tighter now, less cocky. Margaret stepped closer, peering at the sketch, her lips thinning. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Some old drawing doesn't mean anything. You're grasping at straws, Leela." "Oh, it's not just a drawing," I said, flipping to the next page. An email from Jack to Ethan, dated 6 months after they kicked me out. I'd kept it all these years, buried in an old account I'd barely checked until I started digging. "Jack sent you this, Ethan. My pitch, my ideas, word for word. You remember, don't you, Jack?" I turned to him, and he looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "Lila, Jack started, his voice shaking, but Ethan cut him off, whirling on him. "What the hell is she talking about? You said you came up with the biofabric concept." Jack's mouth opened, then closed, his hands fidgeting with his tie. The crowd was leaning in now, whispers rippling through the room. I didn't, Jack mumbled, barely audible. "Lila told me about it back when we were together. She was done with it, right? So I passed it to you, Ethan. I didn't think she'd..." "You didn't think?" Ethan hissed, his face flushing red. "You let me build my whole brand on her garbage idea?" He turned back to me, fury twisting his features. "Even if it's true, so what? You failed, I made it work, it's mine now." I smiled, the kind of smile that makes people nervous, and flipped to the last page. A patent application I'd filed 2 years ago for that same biofabric tech, now a cornerstone of Green Vita's success. "Funny thing about ideas," I said, "they don't belong to you just because you steal them. I perfected it, patented it, and turned it into something you couldn't dream of. Ethan Lux is built on my bones, and I can prove it." The room went dead quiet. Ethan's hands clenched into fists, his breath coming fast. Margaret grabbed the folder from me, scanning it like she could will it to be fake, but her face paled as she read. "This is nonsense," she spat, tossing it back at me. "You think a piece of paper changes anything? Ethan's the genius here, not you." "Genius?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "He's a thief, and Jack's your witness." I looked at Jack again, and he shrank under my gaze, guilt written all over him. "Tell them, Jack. Tell them how you handed my work to him because you thought I'd never come back." Jack swallowed hard, his eyes darting between me and Ethan. I didn't mean for it to blow up like this," he said, his voice breaking. "I gave him the idea. Yeah, I didn't know I thought you were gone, Lila." Ethan lunged at him, grabbing his collar. "You idiot! You're screwing me over for her?" Guests gasped, stepping back as the scene unraveled. I didn't move, just watched Ethan's perfect night start to fray at the edges. Margaret tried to pull him off, hissing, "Stop it, Ethan! You're making a scene!" But it was too late. The truth was out and the crowd knew it. I tucked the folder back into my clutch, calm as ever. "That's just the start," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. "You think this is bad? Wait till you see what else I've got." The ballroom was a mess now. Ethan still had Jack by the collar, Margaret tugging at his arm, guests whispering like a hive of bees about to swarm. I stood there, watching it all unfold, the folder back in my clutch and a quiet thrill running through me. Ethan finally let go of Jack, shoving him back so hard he stumbled into a table, sending a champagne flute crashing to the floor. "You're done," Ethan snarled at him, then spun to face me, his eyes wild. "And you think you've won something? You're still nothing, Lila. This doesn't change a damn thing." I tilted my head, letting his anger wash over me like a wave I'd learned to ride years ago. "Oh, I'm not done," I said, my voice steady, almost soft. That was just the warm-up. Margaret stepped forward, her face a mix of fury and desperation, her usual composure cracking like cheap glass. "What more could you possibly have?" she snapped. "You've humiliated yourself enough. Leave before you make this worse." I reached into my clutch again, this time pulling out a sleek black USB drive. Small, unassuming, but heavy with the weight of what it held. "Funny you mention worse," I said, holding it up between my fingers. "Because this is where it gets ugly." Ethan's eyes narrowed, his breath hitching. Jack looked like he might bolt for the exit. Margaret just stared, her lips parting slightly, like she knew something bad was coming but couldn't stop it. "What's that supposed to be?" Ethan asked, his voice rough, trying to sound tough but failing. I twirled the drive, letting the light catch it, and smiled. "Proof," I said simply. "Proof that while you were busy stealing my ideas, the rest of you were stealing something else. Millions, actually, from that precious charity you've been flaunting for years." The room went still, the kind of quiet that sucks the air out of everything. Margaret's hand flew to her chest, clutching her necklace like it could shield her. "That's a lie," she hissed, but her voice shook. Ethan laughed, short and harsh. "You're bluffing. You've got nothing." "Am I?" I said, stepping closer. "Jack, you remember those emails you sent me a few years back, don't you? When you were drunk and feeling guilty, trying to apologize for ditching me?" Jack's face drained of color, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. "You didn't just say sorry," I went on. "You forwarded me some internal stuff, files from the Hayes Foundation, bank records, donor lists, little notes from Margaret about moving funds. Guess you didn't realize what you were handing over." Jack shook his head, frantic. I wasn't thinking. I didn't mean to." "Shut up, Jack," Ethan barked, but it was too late. I turned to the crowd, raising my voice just enough. "They've been skimming from the charity for years. Millions meant for kids, hospitals, disaster relief, all funneled into offshore accounts. And I've got it all right here." I plugged the USB into a nearby projector. Some tech guy had left it running for Ethan's big presentation, and the screen lit up. Emails, spreadsheets, Margaret's own voice in a grainy audio clip. "We'll take 20% this quarter, Henry. No one's checking." Gasps rippled through the guests. Margaret lunged for the projector, shrieking, "Turn it off, she's lying!" But Ethan grabbed her arm, his face ashen, staring at the screen like it was a death sentence. Jack sank into a chair, head in his hands, muttering, "Oh God, oh God." The numbers didn't lie. Dates, amounts, signatures. It was all there, years of fraud laid bare. "You set us up," Ethan whispered, his voice raw, turning to me. "You planned this." I shrugged, pulling the USB out as the screen went dark. "You taught me to survive," I said. "I just got better at it than you ever expected." "And Jack?" "He didn't even know he was my best weapon." I glanced at him, crumpled and broken, the guy who'd betrayed me twice without even realizing it. The twist wasn't just their crime. It was how their own ally handed me the keys to their downfall, all because he couldn't let go of his guilt. The ballroom was chaos now, guests buzzing like a kicked hive, Margaret clawing at the projector like she could erase what they'd all seen, Ethan staring at me with a mix of rage and disbelief. Jack just sat there, head buried in his hands, a wreck of a man who'd accidentally torched his own life along with theirs. The USB was back in my clutch, but the damage was done. The Hayes Foundation's shiny reputation was ash, and my family's perfect facade was crumbling faster than they could scream. Margaret rounded on me, her face twisted, mascara streaking as she lost her grip. "You spiteful little—" she started, but I cut her off, stepping forward so we were eye to eye. "Careful," I said, my voice low and steady. "You've got bigger problems than me now, like the IRS or the cops who'll be knocking soon." Her mouth snapped shut, her eyes wide, and for the first time in my life I saw fear in them. Real, raw fear. Ethan grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in. "You think you're better than us," he hissed, his breath hot with panic. "You're still the screw-up we dumped. This doesn't change that." I yanked free, meeting his glare without flinching. "You're wrong," I said. "You stopped being my family the night you threw me out. And yeah, I am better because I built something real while you just stole and lied." He opened his mouth to argue, but a sharp voice cut through the noise. "Ethan Hayes?" A man in a crisp suit pushed through the crowd. Some exec from one of the big fashion houses, I guessed. "We're pulling our deal. This is a disgrace." Ethan's face crumpled, and Margaret let out a choked sound, clutching at Henry, who'd finally shuffled forward looking small and lost. "Lila, please," he muttered, his voice barely there. "We can fix this." I laughed, short and cold. "Fix it? You don't get it, do you? This isn't about fixing anything. It's about you facing what you did, to me, to everyone you've screwed over." I turned away, done with them, and started for the doors. The crowd parted, some staring in awe, others in shock. But I didn't care. I'd said my piece. Outside, the night air hit me, cool and sharp, the city humming beyond the hotel's glow. Daniel was waiting by the curb, leaning against our car, his dark eyes catching mine. He didn't say anything, just raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I walked over, my heels clicking on the pavement, and he opened the door for me. "You good?" he asked, his voice quiet, steady, like always. I slid into the seat, letting out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "Better than good," I said, grinning as he got in beside me. "Let's grab some ice cream. I'm starving." He chuckled, starting the engine, and we pulled away, the hotel shrinking in the rear view. They'd thought they'd broken me 12 years ago, left me with nothing but shame and a slammed door, but I'd clawed my way up, turned their rejection into fuel, and tonight I'd burned their world down. Revenge wasn't the point, freedom was. And as the city lights streaked past, Daniel's hand brushing mine, I felt it. Light, unburdened,